The day Frank Canton snapped iron shackles around his son's wrists and walked him to a cell that smelled like piss and gunpowder, he didn't flinch once, because this was the third time he'd killed someone with his own last name, just the first time he'd done it legally. The iron shackles closed around wrists that had learned to grip a pistol the same way they'd learned to hold a spoon, at their father's table, under their father's roof, with their father's blood pumping through veins that would soon carry him to the gallows. Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory, 1895. Sheriff Frank Canton stands in his own jailhouse, booking his 23-year-old son for murder, and the smell of cheap whiskey and gun oil hangs so thick you could cut it with a bowie knife, still logged in the evidence locker. The paperwork is immaculate. Canton's handwriting doesn't shake once. But there's something you need to understand about Frank Canton before you start painting him as some tragic hero of frontier justice. This man had already reinvented himself twice, and the badge on his chest was the third lie in a career built on gun smoke and erasure. Born Joe Horner in 1849, he'd ridden with Texas rustlers before he turned 20. Got himself elected sheriff of Johnson County, Wyoming in 1882 under a stolen name because Joe Horner was wanted in 3 states for cattle theft and suspected murder. That's the man who raised William Canton. That's the moral education the boy received. Frank Canton preached law and order from a pulpit built on forged documents and buried bodies. And when the regulators came calling in 1892, wealthy cattlemen hired guns looking to exterminate homesteaders. Canton rode with them. He was there at the TA Ranch during the Johnson County War, rifle in hand, when 50 hired killers tried to execute a death list of 70 small ranchers. Federal troops stopped that particular massacre, but Canton walked away clean. He always did. The badge was camouflage, you see. It gave him proximity to the cattleman's money and legal cover for the killing he was already inclined toward. By 1895, he'd parlayed that into the Oklahoma Territory appointment, dragging his family south to Guthrie, where federal jurisdiction was loose enough that a man's past could stay buried if he kept moving and kept his stories straight. William Canton grew up watching his father operate, watched him collect payoffs, watched him turn prisoners over to lynch mobs when it was convenient, watched the casual brutality that frontier justice required when you stripped away the mythology. The boy learned that laws were negotiable, that violence solved problems, that if you wore the right uniform, you could commit almost any sin and call it duty. Frank Canton taught his son everything he knew, just didn't expect the lesson to take quite so literally. April 14th, 1895. William Canton walks into the Red Dog Saloon in Guthrie with a Colt 45 and a grudge against a gambler named Thomas McGuire. The dispute was over cards, or a woman, or money. The witnesses couldn't agree, and it probably didn't matter. What mattered was William put 3 rounds into McGuire's chest at a range of 8 feet, reloaded while McGuire bled out on the sawdust, already stained of a decade of other men's blood, then stood there drinking whiskey until the deputies arrived. He didn't run, didn't even holster the weapon, just waited like he expected his father to fix it the way Frank had fixed everything else that went wrong in their lives. But here's where the popular story goes sideways. The legend says Frank Canton was a tragic figure torn between duty and blood, that he agonized over the decision, that breaking his own son broke something fundamental in his soul. Look at the actual evidence. Frank Canton placed William under arrest approximately 90 minutes after the shooting, not because he'd been soul-searching, but because he'd been calculating. 3 dozen witnesses saw William Canton murder Thomas McGuire. The territorial judge was already making noise about corruption in the sheriff's office. Frank Canton had survived rustling charges, the Johnson County War, and 2 decades of borderline criminal behavior by always knowing when to cut his losses. William was a liability, a drunk, violent liability who just committed murder in front of half the town and was too stupid or too arrogant to manufacture even a thin excuse. Frank Canton looked at his son and saw a complication that could unravel everything. The job, the respectability, the carefully constructed fiction of Frank Canton, Lawman. So he made the only choice that mattered. He chose himself. The trial took 3 days. Frank Canton testified against his son, laid out the evidence with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd used forging his own identity papers 15 years earlier. Described the murder weapon, a Colt .45 with custom grips, serial number filed off, the same gun Frank had given William for his 21st birthday. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity. The jury took 45 minutes to convict. Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge, showed more mercy than expected. 20 years hard labor at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth instead of the rope. Frank Canton stood in the courtroom and showed no emotion whatsoever. He'd already moved on. William Canton served 11 years before tuberculosis killed him in 1906, still behind bars, still waiting for a father who never visited once. The prison records list his next of kin as unknown. Frank Canton had literally erased him from the family history, the same way he'd erased Joe Horner decades before. By then, Frank was in Alaska, wearing a different badge, reinventing himself for the 4th time, probably telling stories about frontier justice to people who didn't know enough to check the facts. Here's what the legend makers always miss. Frank Canton wasn't torn between duty and family. He didn't agonize. He weaponized the one thing William still believed in, his father's authority, and turned it into the mechanism of his son's destruction. That's not tragedy. That's calculation. That's a man who'd spent his entire life practicing survival at other people's expense, finally turning that skill on the one person who trusted him absolutely. The real horror isn't that Frank Canton arrested his own son. The real horror is how little it seemed to cost him. He lived another 21 years, died in 1927 at age 78, still collecting a federal pension, still telling the story as proof of his unwavering commitment to justice. The man who'd ridden with rustlers, participated in wholesale murder attempts, and destroyed his own child for professional convenience, somehow became a folk hero. They put his name in history books, called him incorruptible. William Canton rotted in a prison cell and then a pauper's grave, while his father toured the territory giving speeches about law and order. The tuberculosis took 17 months to kill him, long enough to understand that the iron shackles closed around more than just his wrists that day in Guthrie. They'd closed around any illusion that blood meant something, that family could survive the machinery of ambition, that the man who taught you how to hold a gun wouldn't use that same education to justify putting you in the ground.